You mentioned liberal Democrats in the United States and how they kind of go along with this rhetoric of the very existence of Palestinians being a demographic threat to Israel. Can you tell us where has Joe Biden and his cabinet been in terms of Palestine and Israel recently? And also after that, can you talk about where have the progressive Democrats been, the squad and the other progressive Democrats?
So when it comes to the Biden administration, I think that because of these normalization deals that Trump called, peace deals between Israel and the various Gulf state countries, because of those deals and because the issue of Palestine in the last 10 years in the Middle East has seemed to kind of wane as an issue that people in the Middle East care about because they're dealing with so many other issues, whether it's the economic collapse in Lebanon or the dirty war on Syria that has now turned into a sanctions war on Syria, whether it's Iraq was invaded and occupied and just completely shattered as a society because of what the U.S. did in the last 2 decades. People's own front yards, if you will, have just been so devastated, and there's been so much violence, the rise and fall of ISIS, all of these things that have happened, that it kind of seemed like Palestine wasn't the central issue anymore. And it really seemed like Israel had Palestinians under absolute control. Like they had them completely pacified. This was the thinking, not my thinking. This was just, I think, the general thinking among sort of liberal Democrat America, people in the Biden administration, is that Palestinians are pacified. Israel has control. There's no issue. It's just a status quo of apartheid. They figured out how to make it work. We can move on to other things. We can move on to going back to the Iran deal. We can move on to kind of moving away from the Middle East and paying more attention to investing more in this great power competition with China, this new Cold War. That's been the rhetoric of the Biden administration since he came into office. Even in the speeches he's given, the Middle East hasn't really been at the forefront of any of those speeches. The Israel-Palestine issue has certainly not been at the forefront at all. It's been all China, Russia, China, Russia. And so I think that they were really taken by surprise, as a lot of people were, by this, what I can only call is a Palestinian uprising. I don't want to say it's an intifada. That's a little bit too hyperbolic for what's happening. We can't call it that quite yet, and it might never be that, but it certainly is some sort of uprising and definitely unrest. And, the Israeli side has just exploded in violence. And I think, they also may not have realized just how right-wing Israel has become. I mean, the Israeli government in the last 20 years has become so incredibly right-wing that there are Kahanists in the government, people who are followers of Meir Kahane, who's this religious messianic
Hi.
extremist who, sorry, somebody's speaking. I hear someone. No,
it must have been background noise.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. But you have people who support this guy Meir Kahane who envisioned historic, a greater Israel that he wanted to remove all Palestinians, just remove them ethnically, send them all to Saudi Arabia, get rid of them all, and let's make a greater Israel. Let's even a greater Israel that includes Lebanon and parts of Syria, and let's just go all the way. There are people who support that ideology now in the Israeli government because Netanyahu has made this alliance with the far right in order to maintain his power. Israeli society has become more racist. I think it's probably one of the only places in the world I can think of that's at least considered a part of the Western world or whatever, that's accepted into Western polite democratic society as a country that's supposed to be reflective of those values. I think it's one of the only places like that where younger people are actually more right-wing than their parents and their teachers. That's a real, they're more racist. Younger people in Israel are more racist than their parents, which is kind of the opposite of what you're seeing in places like the US or across Europe, where younger people tend to be leaning more progressive and more accepting and more tolerant. And so I think that, anyways, I think the Biden administration didn't really see this coming, as a lot of people didn't. They just thought that the issue of Israel-Palestine was solved, permanent apartheid, oh well. And so there was a level of disengagement from the beginning of this administration on this issue, so that when this did happen, there was really nothing in place, no one in place to help de-escalate it. Um, and so I think by the Biden administration just kind of went into autopilot, and autopilot for America is support Israel unconditionally, say nothing, and let them do whatever they want. But I think that there also, um, we can't be dismissive of the fact that there has been a shift. And I don't want to overhype how important this shift is, because in terms of policy, I don't think anything's going to change. But in terms of the popular narrative around this issue, and in terms of the Democratic Party itself, there is definitely a shift taking place. And I think there's a couple reasons for that shift. I think part of it has to do with the organizing work for the last several years around issues of racism in America, and how the issue of Palestine has been important to and attached to that. I mean, I remember back when the Ferguson uprising was happening, there was this like beginning of this understanding that the issue of policing in America and the issue of racism against Palestinians is connected, because you have these police exchanges where all these different, all these American police like all these different American policing institutions go to Israel to train with the Israeli police and like learn how to control and dominate people under occupation. And then sometimes they take those lessons and apply them back in the US, and vice versa. Israel also comes and trains with the American police departments and takes those lessons back to the US. So I think that the sort of anti-racist movement, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, has helped draw attention to that issue, and also people becoming more understanding of the issues of racism and how state violence against people who are like unpeople function, and applying that logic to Palestine has helped. And a lot of the Palestine organizing that's taken place has also helped bring understanding to this issue. But I also think the Trump administration's close alliance with the Israeli government, particularly with Netanyahu and the Likud party, really helped educate a lot of liberals and Democrats on just how right-wing Israel is. It's kind of like a country that, if the Republican Party ran a country completely, that it would look like Israel. And so they started to see Israel as kind of like an arm of the Republicans. And even I think, there's also a shift among American Jews on this issue. Younger American Jews are really disgusted by the behavior of the Israeli government. They're not invested in Zionism as much as maybe their parents or grandparents were. They're far removed from World War II and the Holocaust, and it's just harder to weaponize that issue against them. And they live in like America, which is a multicultural place. Of course, it's very flawed, but it is a multicultural place where liberals like to say, oh, like everybody gets to vote and everybody has equal rights, and they like to celebrate that. And so if you grow up in that culture, as a minority, and you're doing great as a minority in America, then you can't possibly look at Israel and be okay with the exclusionary eliminationist politics in that country and how it's led to all this violence against Palestinians. And so I think because of all the organizing around this issue, because of shifting opinions of younger people, and because of really the anti-racist struggle being at the forefront of American progressive politics, I think all of this has helped really shift opinion on this issue in the US. And that's why you see progressive members of Congress speaking out so forcefully on this issue. I mean, I think also, you have groups like Human Rights Watch, which isn't some like radical leftist group. In fact, sometimes it's used as like a weapon of the US government in terms of weaponizing human rights. But they also did write this report recently basically accusing Israel of apartheid. That's a big deal. And so it also helps give these progressive members of Congress cover for when they call Israel an apartheid state. So I think that all of this kind of mixed together is a reason that you see the rhetoric on this issue shifting, at least in the mainstream and in the Democratic Party to some extent. That said, I don't want to get too excited, because I still think policy changes are still years away. Because at the end of the day, even if Democrats hate Israel, the Democratic Party is still a party of imperialism. And the reason Israel is so important and is such an ally of the US and considered so valuable to the US is because it acts as an arm of US imperialism in the Middle East. It's like a client state, much in the same way that Saudi Arabia is. So because of that, because of its usefulness in the Middle East as this kind of like policing apparatus, it's like a bully in the Middle East for US imperialism. Because of that, Israel can get away with murder, and I think will probably continue to get away with murder.